So we last left off talking about reviewing of comparisons, talking about these two works. Let's move on to, once again, let's look at these for a second. These are the ones that you have to write your paper on. Hopefully, with each of these kind of comparisons, you're having a little bit more of a sense of ways that you can compare these two works. So I think comparing them in terms of use of line would be very useful. Comparison in terms of value would be very useful. Comparison in terms of color organization would be useful. Comparison, and think about how every comparison you make should kind of center around how, what are the most important areas of the piece, and what are the areas of emphasis, and why are those the areas of emphasis? How does the painting create those areas of emphasis? I think comparisons in terms of page structure. Remember some of the basic structures to Baroque painting in terms of geometric or kind of page organization that we talked about earlier. And trying to think if well, those are a good starting point at least. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so this is a pretty good, very similar kind of comparison. On the right here we have an Otto Dix. It's a print, and over here we have a Van Dyck, Anthony Van Dyck portrait painting, and it's an oil painting. And so we can start with any number of, let's start with value. I think that is one of the main differences that stands out right away. So we can say that the Van Dyck is overall much darker, the Otto Dix is overall much lighter. We can say that the value contrast is much greater in the Van Dyck, right? From the lightest light to the darkest dark. There's a huge amount of value decisions and a huge amount of value difference. And we can also say like the value range is very narrow in the Otto Dix. In terms of the speed of contrast, that's maybe a little trickier, but I would say that the speed of contrast is a little bit faster. There's a sense of certain areas getting a lot of strong light, and that the overall space is dark in the Van Dyck, where there's not really much sense of light at all in the Otto Dix. It's kind of avoiding that issue entirely. Another way to look at the comparison between these two, like I said, is to think about what are the organization, the composition. And in Baroque compositions, one of the first things we tend to think about is it using corner-to-corner diagonals? And if it is it doing the sort of classic kind of T-junction thing, where it's organizing primarily around one corner-to-corner diagonal, and then organizing like on diagonals that go from the corner to a perpendicular point on that corner-to-corner. And as you look at the Van Dyck, it does actually seem like that was probably sort of an underlying structure that he was unconsciously using. It was such a common way of thinking about composition in the Baroque, so it's not surprising that this portrait falls into that pretty neatly. Whereas in the Otto Dix, it much more seems like a kind of a zigzag, right? Like there's a diagonal that goes from corner to maybe somewhere around a third, and then a diagonal that goes from this corner down, maybe a little bit lower, like almost like a tilted X kind of shape, or a zigzag kind of shape. And so page structure would definitely be something to think about. And then how your eye moves through the composition, the visual pathway would be certainly another way we could compare these two. And certainly, as we're looking at the Otto Dix, we have to think about, well, what are the areas of focus? What are the areas of emphasis? And it seems like obviously the face of the child and the face of the cat are pretty important areas of emphasis. And then like the linear elements of the body of the cat, of the arm, right, become elements that lead us from area to area. There's kind of an interaction between the hand and the head of the cat as kind of like a sub, kind of focus sub area. And then on top of that we have these two bows They're sort of tertiary focuses in the image. In the Van Dyck, the areas of emphasis are organized in a very classic Baroque way, which is that the areas of light are the primary areas of focus. And obviously her face is the primary focus, and then the secondary areas of focus would be her two hands, this hand holding the flower, and so in that case a little bit of extra dash of color helps make that area a little bit more of a focus. Also like her torso, chest, and then as a maybe a tertiary or even less obvious focus would be this little extra light here on the edge of her arm to her dress. Then there are also like these spots of color and these kind of brocaded buttons, as well as this kind of detailing on the dress as well, here and here. But all of those would be kind of tertiary or further below. One of the things that's kind of come up, but I want to make it a little bit more explicit once again, in terms of thinking about both color and shape and line and texture. One of the main things that's different between these two is that in the Van Dyck, it's a very illusionistic representation in which the artist is very loyal to the idea of the atmosphere and the light and the lighting of the space, you know, this overall dark atmospheric space, and the strong lighting on her. And that's all part of being really loyal to the idea of her really representing her as if she was really seated there, right? Whereas in the Dicks, it's much more about breaking things down into shape, right? And not worrying so much about the representation being in any particular way real, but more emphasizing just the fact that it's all made up of areas of pattern and texture and color and shape, right? And line. And so all of those decisions are much more explicit, much more obvious here in the Autodix. Like we can really see lines draw the contours of the figure, whereas we can't see the lines draw any of these edges. They're all kind of become hidden into the painting. There was an initial line drawing to this, right? We can be sure of that, but it's not something that we can see all that clearly. The lines now become entirely implied. But we could, just comparing the quality of those lines, we could say that the lines in the Autodix are much more angular and fast, aggressive, right? Whereas the lines in the Van Dyck are more fluid and slower, more languorous, and that kind of like, that's typical of Baroque painting, where the movement of like the lines of figure and the lines of drapery are meant to be very kind of like slow and meandering and very curvilinear, as a part of a way of making the painting very luxurious to read. Whereas this painting is the jaggedness, quick angularness of the lines is all about the speed of viewing the image. And let's see, anything else I want to say about these two? I think that covers a lot. Alright, let's move on. Oh, I guess the other thing I would say is that there's a much wider color contrast, right? That we just have a much wider range of colors in the Autodix compared to the Van Dyck. Okay, here's another comparison, and I probably don't have much time, but I just want to show this one and this. I think that's the idea. Those two, and I'm probably just going to talk about these two. First thing I want to point out is overall how the Vermeer is much cooler. Right, you wouldn't necessarily think of it as being a particularly cool painting until you compare it to the Fragonard over here, which is overall warm. And you can really feel that the underpainting of this Fragonard, which was this kind of warm sienna sort of color, comes through everything, even this kind of cool purplish gray. That warm underpainting comes through. Whereas in the Vermeer, overall, even the neutral colors, right, feel more cool, and even the warm light shining through the window doesn't feel all that warm. It feels a very kind of cool type warmth. But the local colors, we have a lot of local colors in the blue region, And even this